opening the archives of Queen Elizabeth II, a speech was found which was never held. In 1983, some probably frightful speechwriters wrote a speech or drafted a speech for the Queen about the atomic or the possibility of a nuclear catastrophe, and that she was about how she should address that in that sort of event. And for those of us who grew up in the 80s, many would remember the feeling of fear of a nuclear catastrophe, either with the Soviets bombing the NATO or NATO bombing the Soviet or whatever. But if we fast forward 40 years up to today, there's sort of a renaissance for apocalyptic fear and apocalyptic communication. And perhaps someone would say that the fear of the nuclear or the atomic bomb is perhaps even more, how do you put it? Present in some sense.
It's imminent.
Yeah. It's imminent today.
So
perhaps before we start all this, I'm Bård Norheim, and you are?
You are Haga.
Yeah, and we've just published this book on, that's the way, the 3 fears every leader has to know on words to use in a crisis. So this will be a short conversation on the apocalyptic. And
so I think, Bård, this is a very good place to start. I think we grew up in an era of apocalyptic anxiety. We were both 10 years at the time when the speech should be held.
Yeah.
If a nuclear threat actually was actualized or put into effect. And nowadays, it seems even more imminent and threatening. This and the probability is perhaps higher than those days. But I just wanted to just place the apocalyptic threat on a level that is on a very basic threat or fear level, and because we have written a book about the 3 fears.
Yes.
And this is one of them, and perhaps the most profound.
Yeah, at least because the apocalyptic fear is the fear that the world will cease to exist, at least the way we know it. So it's the sort of fear that threatens our whole existence.
Yeah.
Like we could sometimes, the climate crisis, or people communicating about the climate crisis would say that if we don't act now, it might be too late.
Yeah.
And the meaning, and saying that is not just that the welfare state will cease to exist, but it's that life in itself, or the conditions for life, will be changed in such a way that we can't really live here.
So life, as we know it, is on its most profound at threat in this.
Yeah, and that's the first
fear,
the apocalyptic fear. Yeah, and then the second one would then be the political fear, which affects our social order. So if you live in a particular country, it's the fear that if you're invaded by another nation, your nation will cease to exist, or
you will enter another political order.
Yeah. So that's the fear, obviously, that Ukrainians are facing today.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you have what we have called private fear, which on one level would have to do with the fear of losing your job, or perhaps that your health would deteriorate, or that you would, in the ultimate case, die in some sense. But that's your private thing. But it could also be an element of shame, which is the sort of metaphorical use of the private fear, that how can I live with myself if I act in this manner, or if we act in this manner. So interestingly, before we move to the atomic, Greta Thunberg's appeal to how dare you in 2019 is sort of hitting both those kinds of fear. It's both the apocalyptic, the fear that the world will cease to exist, but it's also to the adults saying that how dare you, how can you live with this? It's also a private appeal to this private fear. But what happens when, particularly in Europe, when we've had peace, at least in some sense, for 80 years, there have been some wars that have been affecting some areas really heavily. But up until now, we've had peace on the continent for a long time, and it seems to me that there's something theoretic for some people, at least, about the nuclear fear. It's really hard to grasp, isn't it?
It is, and I think so. For the speech that you referred to, the speech not held by Thatcher, or was it the Queen?
Actually, the Queen Elizabeth II. Yeah,
so I suspect it was written by someone in Thatcher's government,
probably.
Yeah. I think the Cold War, as it was, or as it were, at that time, it was more or less a state of sort of stasis, as the Greek says. Yeah. It was sort of put on hold. No warm war, no actual fighting. And I think that is the background of our sort of distance feeling to this very war thing, that we have experienced a cool down in war itself. Yeah. Nevertheless, it was felt as a very real threat. We had a fear, I remember, of
perhaps also because the images of Nagasaki and Hiroshima were so close in some sense. I mean, they were vivid, living images, and you could easily imagine what would happen if. Numerous sort of movies made about what would happen to the east coast of the U.S. if a nuclear missile would hit during the Cold War.
Yes.
Yeah.
And many of the addresses I remember from Ronald Reagan, for example, had this imagery as a horizon or a background of his speeches. But I think when it's addressed or when it's felt, this fear, good leaders, they will try to address it and to describe the reality in which people live with this fear.
So what you're saying is that if you're a political leader or even a leader of a business, and the landscape, so to say, is in some sense apocalyptic, or the terrain has some sort of apocalyptic flavor to it, it's key to the ability to name that fear and adequately address how one should respond to it, is what leadership is about. So, because we often heard that leaders should not play on fear, or we should not appeal to fear because it's manipulative, or but I guess what we're saying in this book is that there's no way around fear. Fear is inevitable.
So the case for avoiding fear is to some extent true if the concept of fear is very narrowly described as a reference to, if you don't do this, I will sort of do something harmful to you. But I think let's take the climate fear that is sort of an apocalyptic fear as well, but on a different level and with a different kind of time frame to attach to it, because it's it's a problem that we are
we're facing it now, but the consequences will be, perhaps next summer will be even warmer, but it won't be, it might be unbearable for some, but not for all.
Yes.
So that's the difference. If a nuclear bomb hits, it's in a blink of an eye, and then it's over for many or for most of us.
Yeah, so
in that sense, might we talk about two different kinds of apocalyptic fears in some sense?
Perhaps, yes. And the threat of a climate that is becoming warmer is not so. It's not so sure what the actual consequences are. Whereas for a nuclear bomb, if it hits a city, the damage would be devastating, and we know that. But now we are faced with a real war in Europe. It's
a warm war.
It's a warm war, and it's an ongoing war, and the outcome is not certain. And one of the key players here, and the actual aggressor, Russia, has loads and loads of nuclear bombs.
But there's an interesting paradox here, and that is that on one hand, the nuclear or the atomic bombs, they are what we fear. So they've risen in if we think about a hierarchy of fears, where at some point we fear the pandemic at the most, at another point it's suddenly the climate crisis, and now it might be an actual war or an atomic bomb, because the system in Russia seems to be so unstable. But at the same time, since this is an energy crisis, ironically, the nuclear or the atomic plays also a key role as a sort of solution to the crisis. So that's a very sort of paradoxical, almost ironical part here. So in 2011, because of the Fukushima, as a direct response to the Fukushima incident or disaster in Japan, the German Bundestag, and with Merkel at the very front, they declared a moratorium on nuclear plants. Whereas this is, so now the moratorium is stopped or paused, because we sense that there's a downside here that we didn't calculate. So depending on Russian gas is perhaps even more challenging. Yeah.
And I think, so what you are referring to, namely the closing down of the nuclear electrical plants in Germany, was the response to the threat of a nuclear meltdown. And out of fear, Merkel and the German politicians just closed down the shop that had produced electricity.
And had secured them with sort of homemade electricity, one must say.
Yeah.
Because if we look at, if we just for a little while rewind back to the end of the 1970s, the big discussion in the US was what President Jimmy Carter addressed in his speech on the crisis of confidence, where the goal was to become independent, and not self-sufficient on energy, because they saw that if we depend on the Middle East producers of gas and oil, we're much more volatile and fragile. And interestingly, I don't think there's much attention being paid to this in Norwegian context in particular. Obama said with pride at the end of his period, it was me people saying that how he increased the production of gas and oil within the US and where they passed this threshold of being self-sufficient.
Yes, and it's in a sense that the very acknowledgement of modern society's dependence on energy that has become also a security question, and it has always been. But Angela Merkel and the German politicians, and also many other in Europe, they trusted the Russians to be stable deliverers of cheap gas, and it failed.
And isn't it also because we, in liberal democracies built on capitalism of some sort, we believe that if you do trade with people, over time, they will befriend you. And if that is not the case, we're sort of surprised.
Yes, and I think that was the idea of Merkel, that change will come about through trade. And she also deliberately rejected LNG plants or receiving capabilities of gas from ships in order to persuade the Russians that we are now building our lines towards Russia, not doing any backup.
So we want to be inseminated, to use a very bold metaphor, only by one party here. Yeah.
Yes, and it was an attempt of building trust.
Exactly. So by saying that we put all our eggs in one basket in some sense. But if we look at this from a business perspective for a while, let's say you're in Norway and have this idea of using thorium as a nuclear source. What sort of arguments could you use if you say, I want to be part of the new green economy, and what we see now with the attack on the Nord Stream 1 and 2 shows us how volatile and insecure the provision of gas is. So what sort of arguments could a business leader give to both persuade politicians, but also perhaps a people? Because there's a popular element to this as well.
Yeah, so I think the very problem, our fear is sort of double in this respect, because we fear the consequences of our production of energy, but we fear even more
the lack of it.
The lack of it.
Yeah.
And I think the normal way to talk about it nowadays is to differentiate that we need in the energy mix. We need many suppliers, and we need many sources of energy. And but at the end, we need to rely on them. So I think the case for being able to draft a map of secure energy supplies, that is a very strong argument in today's debate, I suppose.
So in one sense, if you were a business leader and you would set out a plan for why this development of thorium would be the most secure thing, of course, there's an element here that what one in rhetoric would call the logos part, so sort of convincing with a sort of science shows that this and that with thorium, but there's also a pathos element that although the logos structure would be very convincing, people would still remember the image of the Hiroshima bomb or some things that would, even not to mention the Chernobyl disaster. So you sort of...
Yeah, it's really interesting that you bring up that problem of the logos argument. You know, Aristotle distinguishes between the enthymem, the proceeding from certain presupposed axioms, some presupposed matter of fact. I mean, the audiences would just say, this is self-evident. Yeah. And then you just proceed from that and you reach some conclusions. But he also said that the speaker can also use a more inductive method, just pointing to examples and then draw conclusions from that. And I think what Angela Merkel did in 2011, when she pointed to the example of Japan, she said, look what's happening there. This can happen here as well. We have to stop this. And by doing that, she was also inferring to the very story of modernity, because we have built our wealth, our very existence as sort of modern human beings on exploiting nature. And she was also dealing with this problem of how should we be a part of nature when we are actually exploiting nature. And I think that was an attempt to strike balance. We have to move from nuclear power to solar and wind power.
So nuclear power was then put in the basket of nature exploitation. So then we're exploiting.
Yeah.
Whereas some would argue again, then, well, that's the cleanest energy we have.
And that is what is so interesting now, because the same people who argued that this is the most problematic energy source, they are now saying, but this is the cleanest.
Yeah.
So we can see that the appeal to what we fear might be something that we trust in the next corner, but there has not been very radical changes in the industry in 12, 11 years.
So in some sense, it's our perception that changes.
Exactly. And that is what makes so rhetoric so dynamic and vibrant, because you cannot have secure references. They might change with the audience.
It might even happen overnight in some sense.
Yeah, in some sense. And that happened with the supply of gas to Europe.
So let's talk a bit about this, because I think when we grew up in the 80s, we, at least some, feared, that's what Sting sang about in the song The Russians. So you would fear that foreign power, but at the same time, the image was that they might be hardliners, but they were not nutcases, or they were not lunatics, or moving in every direction. So what seems to be the new case now is that you once thought you could trust the Russians or Russian authorities, but now, at least from a Western perspective, how can we trust Putin and his allies? Or even more, if we move this to North Korea, how can we trust the Kims? So that's sort of been the logic of making this family of nuclear owners very small, is that if you divide it, then at one point it will be in the hands of someone who's just simply not reliable.
So in order to make use of rhetoric in this situation of fear, you have to sort of imagine some kind of rationality on the other side. If it's completely irrational, then I think the case is lost. But language and the dialectics, that is the talking, the way of speaking, addresses rationality to the listeners. I think in any case. So if you think it's possible to describe fear or address fear, then you sort of you're in a sense making it rational. And I think that is at the heart of the optimism that is apparent in our book on treating apocalyptic fear, that it's possible to talk about it. I think it's very important to address it, just in order to make it rational in a sense. And for example, by constantly supervising the NATO countries' use of not being involved directly in the war, is also to secure that two parts with atomic weapons are not directly engaged into another. And to me, it seems that's in some sense to address fear
with a certain rationality in some sense.
Yeah.
Another thing in the 80s was, particularly towards the latter part of the 80s, were all these rather optimistic songs about how we could all over the world join hands and make world peace. And I remember, for instance, for the Seoul Olympics, you had this anthem of "Hand in hand we stand" all across the land, and we can make this world a better place in which to live. Sort of that we are the world anthem, just growing. But in political theory, there's always the concept of foe and friend. There's always, even more so in rhetoric, who's your adversary? And how does that play out when it comes to apocalyptic fear today?
Yeah, so the friend-foe understanding, for example, in the rather scary theory of Carl Schmitt, for example, is that to say that your political unity is a kind of friendship that distinguishes itself from another political unity. And you will always regard your internal enemies within the political unity, for example, people from another party or from a completely different political understanding, as on one level friends. Because if you are attacked, then you will defend this political order. And I think that is very important to acknowledge and to understand. But there is a higher order, and that is the apocalyptic. Because if your defense of the political order involves actually destroying the very possibility of existence,
there won't be any foes anymore.
And there won't be either friends or
foes.
No foes.
Yeah, exactly.
So you would just destroy yourself, and that was the logic, I think, of the scaling down
in the late 80s. So
yeah.
I remember vividly, sort of Gorbachev and Reagan meeting on Iceland, for instance, for some of the peace talks, and then was this feeling that if we continue to upscale this, it leads to self-destruction on both sides.
Yep.
We seem a bit further from that logic now, because perhaps because the symmetry has changed. I don't know.
Yeah, and if you look back on that situation where we were worried of a nuclear threat, actually it was the longest period in history where there were more or less peace, at least warm. There was an absence of a warm war. So the Cold War was actually a sort of guaranteeing peace for a very long period of time. It is on a very high cost, of course, and it creates anxiety. But the paradox is that this extreme weapon of mass destruction has actually sort of upped the game to a level that is not possible to execute anything, because it will just imply self-destruction. Mm-hmm. In the long term, however, what you're suggesting is of course that other smaller states will get hold of this terrible weapon, and then fear is of a different order.
Yeah, and then fear is all around in some sense to rewrite the song. In some way, I think we find this to be an optimistic book.
Yeah.
Even though it's about fear. Why is that?
I think it has to do what we have just said now. I think first of all, fear belongs to the human experience.
It's part of our reality. In some sense, it's inescapable.
Yeah. So those who say you should not appeal to fear, they have a in some sense a good case, because appealing to fear could in some situations mean that you are suggesting retaliation or revenge or harmful acts. On the other hand, fear is a part of human existence. We have always feared something. And I think it is politically irresponsible not to fear, for example, climate change.
And isn't it all about a part of the vocation of being a politician, or the vocation of even being a business leader, is to be able to interpret where are we now, and to say that this situation, what sort of situation is this? What does it call for? And that interpreting the hierarchy or the hierarchy of fears is part of saying that, well, in the 90s we feared this, but now we need to fear this, and that's why we need to do this.
Yes, because nobody would today accuse Churchill of playing the fear card.
No. In 1940.
In 1940, when he was faced with Hitler.
Yeah.
And then just praise Chamberlain for proclaiming peace in our time. And I think it's...
Isn't the point also that we didn't know, at that time, no one really knew that Churchill was right?
But nobody knows.
Yeah.
So this is the sort of challenge to address. I mean, in the 80s, when they started to understand that there was something going on with the climate, the people who addressed it as an imminent threat, they were making a bold move, because it was not self-evident that our climate was changing in the sense that they described it. And I think it's a situation you have to interpret the sign of the times, so to speak, in order to interpret it correctly.
We move towards an end here now, but I was wondering, is there a sort of ethical or perhaps virtuous response to fear? Or may we cultivate our appeal to fear in ways that are more ethical than others? So typically, or traditionally, one would say that the virtuous response to fear would be to be courageous.
Mm-hmm.
But courage as a virtue is often described as a rather grey virtue. I mean, even soldiers of an invading army can in some sense be courageous, but for what some would think to be the wrong purpose.
Mm-hmm. So in the old Roman army, the most effective military culture, I think, that we've seen, there was a code of conduct that if you were too brave, if you broke out of the line, meeting the enemy, then you would be punished, because you sort of opened up to a much graver danger. But being coward was also not very helpful. But it's not. If you're meeting a very strong enemy on a plain field, to regroup behind the lines would perhaps be better than just standing, be the last man standing always. So I think to market this virtue as a grey one is a very pertinent thing, and to do what is necessary involves a description of reality that is, in some sense, true.
So perhaps we end on that note, saying that there's always fear. What is not always that clear is how we interpret that, or should interpret that fear. And then the political or challenge for the leader is, how do we appeal to not just the one fear, but the fears that shape our reality?
Yeah.
And well, let's leave it with that. That's what the sort of constructive advice in the book of the 3 fears every leader has to know, and how to craft words to use in a crisis.